Get this trespasser off our HOA property. The president screamed at two cops pointing at my niece on our lake cabin porch. This pink-suited Karen was radiating pure triumph, finally removing the squatter who dared move into her neighborhood. The officer studied the paperwork carefully. Then something happened that made Karen's face turn white. The cop's next words changed everything. But here's what's insane. This HOA president had been harassing the wrong person for the worst possible reason. Why did she call the cops on my niece at our own cabin? The answer will leave you speechless. Comment where you're watching from. My niece, Emma, had been sitting on the cabin's wraparound porch that morning, coffee steaming in her favorite mug, the one Uncle Thomas gave her that said, "Lake life is the best life." The morning mist was lifting off Lake Clearwater, revealing the mountains beyond, and I remember thinking when she sent me that photo how perfect everything looked. This was her 14th day as the official owner of cabin number 5, the crown jewel of the lakefront properties, and she'd worked so hard for this moment. The cabin was everything she remembered from childhood summers. Honey-colored logs that gleamed in the morning sun, that massive stone fireplace where we'd roasted marshmallows, and yes, that creaky third step on the stairs that Thomas never fixed because he said it was character. At 28, she'd finally saved enough to buy it when Uncle Thomas decided to retire to Arizona, and every legal box was checked, every document filed properly with the county. But those 2 weeks hadn't been the peaceful paradise she'd imagined, not by a long shot. She had received 5 violation notices from the HOA about the most ridiculous things: incorrect paint shade, when she hadn't painted anything non-compliant flower pots, for the same planters that had been there 20 years, and my personal favorite, excessive window size for windows installed in the 1970s. Every morning at 7 a.m. sharp, she'd notice someone watching the cabin from across the road, just standing there, with binoculars like some kind of stalker. Then yesterday she found an anonymous note tucked under her windshield wiper that simply said, "You don't belong here," in angry red letters. Emma had laughed them off when she called me about it, saying Uncle Thomas had warned her the HOA was particular, but this seemed way beyond particular. This felt targeted and personal. At 10:47 that morning, her phone buzzed with an unknown number, and that's when everything went sideways. Emma Harrison. This is Margaret Whitfield, HOA president. The voice was sharp and cold like an icicle. "Yes, Mrs. Whitfield," Emma responded politely. "I'm calling as a courtesy. You have 15 minutes to vacate the premises before law enforcement arrives." Emma told me later she thought it was a prank at first. "Excuse me, this is my home. I have all the paperwork." But Margaret's voice got even colder. "No, Miss Harrison. Thomas Harrison promised to sell this cabin to the HOA. You're trespassing on community property." Emma tried to explain. "That's insane. I have all the legal documents. The deed is in my name." But Margaret cut her off. 15 minutes. I've been more than patient." Then she hung up, just like that, leaving Emma standing there in shock. At 11:05, 2 police cruisers pulled up to the cabin, their lights flashing, but sirens off, which somehow made it even more ominous. Emma's hands were shaking as she grabbed her folder of documents. Deed closing papers, bank transfers, insurance policies, everything she could think of. 2 officers emerged from the cars, one young and eager-looking, maybe fresh out of the academy, and one older and weathered who looked like he'd seen it all. Behind them, Margaret Whitfield stepped out of her white Mercedes, resplendent in a bright pink suit that screamed, "I demand to speak to the manager of life itself," complete with matching shoes and a purse that probably cost more than most people's mortgage payments. Her hair was styled in that helmet-like fashion that hadn't changed since the 80s, sprayed so stiff it wouldn't move in a hurricane. Emma Harrison. The older officer, whose name tag read Rodriguez, asked in a professional but not unkind voice. "Yes, Emma started, but Margaret strutted forward, her heels clicking on the gravel like a countdown to disaster. "Officers, this young woman is squatting in a cabin that belongs to our community. I have documentation," Margaret announced, waving a manila folder like it was a weapon. The younger officer seemed immediately swayed by Margaret's confidence and official-looking demeanor. "Mrs. Whitfield says there was a prior agreement," he began, already reaching for his notepad. Emma held up her deed with trembling hands, her voice shaking but determined. "This is my cabin. I bought it from my uncle. Here's everything. Notarized, filed with the county, completely legal. I closed on October 15th. The money's been transferred. I have insurance. I've been paying the property taxes." Officer Rodriguez took the deed and studied it carefully, his experienced eyes scanning every line while Margaret tapped her foot impatiently. He pulled out his radio and called a dispatch. Need a property records check on 45 Lakeshore Drive, Cabin 5, Clearwater. The radio crackled with static, and those 30 seconds felt like 30 years to Emma. Margaret used the time to continue her performance. Officers Thomas promised me we had an understanding. The HOA needs this cabin for community purposes. This girl manipulated a sick old man. Emma told me later she wanted to scream at that accusation, but she held her tongue. Finally, the radio crackled back to life. Copy that. Records show Emma Harrison as the legal owner purchased October 15th from Thomas Harrison. All paperwork is properly filed. No liens, no disputes on record. Rodriguez handed back the deed with a slight smile. Miss Harrison is the legal owner, Mrs. Whitfield. There's no trespassing here. Margaret's voice went from pink to purple, matching her suit in the worst way possible. That's impossible. I know this cabin. Thomas and I had an arrangement. The HOA has rights. Emma found her voice stronger now with the law on her side. My uncle never mentioned you. I have all his emails about the sale. You're not in any of them. Rodriguez turned to Margaret, his voice taking on a warning tone. You can't keep people from their own homes, ma'am. Making false reports is a crime. The younger officer, now looking embarrassed about his earlier eagerness, stepped forward when Margaret's composure cracked completely. She pointed a manicured finger at Emma, her voice rising to a shriek. You think you've won? You have no idea who you're dealing with. I've been the HOA president for 3 years. I know every rule, every loophole, every way to make your life hell. The younger officer moved closer. Ma'am, that sounds like a threat. Margaret smoothed her jacket, trying to regain control. Just stating facts. The HOA has standards. We'll see if Miss Harrison can meet them. As the police drove away, Margaret lingered like a bad smell, studying the cabin, like a general planning an invasion. Enjoy your morning coffee, she hissed at Emma. It might be your last peaceful one. But why was Margaret so desperate for this specific cabin? And what did she mean by knowing every loophole? Type, Team Emma if you think she should fight back, or sell it if you think she should run. The very next morning, Emma woke at 6 a.m. to the sound of hammering that shook the whole cabin. She stumbled outside in her pajamas to find workers installing a massive sign that read, Private HOA property, residents only, right across the path to the lake. The same path our family had used for 30 years, the path where her father taught her to ride a bike, where she'd walked every summer morning to go fishing with Uncle Thomas. You can't use this anymore. Margaret appeared like a pink nightmare from behind a tree flanked by 2 burly workers who wouldn't meet Emma's eyes. This is HOA property. Emma tried to stay calm. That path has always been part of the cabin access. It's been used by my family since. But Margaret cut her off by thrusting a stack of papers at her chest. 67 violations, $50,000 in fines, due immediately. Emma read through them in growing disbelief, each one more ridiculous than the last. Incorrect shade of door paint, $500, non-regulation flower varieties, $1,000, curtains visible from outside, $750, and the one that made her call me immediately, breathing too loudly after 10 p.m., $2,000. When Emma called me that morning, her voice was breaking with a mixture of rage and despair. Uncle Marcus, they're fining me $50,000 for breathing too loudly. This can't be legal. I was looking at the violations through video call, and my blood was boiling. What? Let me see that. I read through them, my face getting darker with each ridiculous claim. This is insane. She's literally making up violations. Door paint, you haven't painted anything. Emma's voice got smaller. Maybe I should just sell. I can't afford this fight. I don't have $50,000. I spent everything on the cabin. That's when I had to remind her of something important. Emma, remember what your Uncle Thomas said? In my mind, I could still see Thomas on his deathbed, pressing the cabin key into her palm with shaking hands. This cabin is where your parents got engaged. Where did you learn to swim? It's not just property. It's our family's heart. Never let anyone take it. I told Emma firmly, don't let her win. I know a lawyer, David Richardson, best property attorney in the state. I'm calling him right now. Day 2 brought an escalation that showed just how far Margaret was willing to go. At 10 a.m., an HOA truck blocked Emma's driveway, completely trapping her car. When she called to complain, she was told it was routine maintenance that would last indefinitely. At 2 p.m., she received a notice of utility inspection that threatened to cut her water and power for safety reasons. if she didn't comply with the previous day's violations within 24 hours. By 4 p.m., Margaret herself arrived with 5 HOA inspectors, who were obviously just her friends, dressed in matching polo shirts, demanding entry to assess compliance. Emma stood firm in her doorway, her phone recording everything. "You need a court order to enter my home." Margaret smiled coldly, a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "We'll see about that. Did you know the HOA can make life very difficult for non-compliant residents? You haven't seen anything yet." And that evening, Emma found her garbage cans overturned with trash scattered across her lawn, and her security camera caught Margaret's white Mercedes driving away from the scene at exactly the time it happened. On day 3, Margaret called an emergency HOA meeting, scheduling it for a time when most working people couldn't attend. Emma arrived 10 minutes late because someone had let the air out of her tires, just enough to make them low, but not obviously slashed. The meeting room was packed with 50 homeowners, most looking confused or scared. A projector showed Emma's cabin on screen like a crime scene photo. "We're here to discuss the danger posed by Emma Harrison," Margaret announced dramatically, clicking through slides that showed Emma's cabin from every angle. She'd used a telephoto lens to make normal things look sinister. A garden hose became improperly stored equipment. A bird feeder became unauthorized wildlife attraction device. And somehow she'd even photographed Emma through her kitchen window, making breakfast, labeling it non-regulation cooking activities. Margaret ranted, "She's destroying our property values. Thomas promised to sell to the HOA. She's a squatter who manipulated a dying man." That's when something unexpected happened. Dorothy, an 82-year-old resident who'd lived there longer than anyone, shakily stood up, gripping her walker for support. "Margaret, stop lying," she said in a voice that carried surprising strength. The room fell completely silent. You could have heard a pin drop. "I heard you on the phone last week. You said you've been planning this since last year. You said, and I quote, 'I'll get that cabin one way or another.' You've been planning this since you heard Thomas was sick." Margaret's face went white as printer paper. "Dorothy, you're confused." But Dorothy wasn't done. "I'm old, not stupid. You've bullied us for 3 years. Sarah got fined $5,000 for planting tomatoes instead of flowers. Bob was threatened with liens for walking his dog at non-regulation times. We're all terrified of you." The room started buzzing with whispers as people realized they weren't alone in their fear. The room sat in stunned silence for a moment, processing the magnitude of Margaret's deception. Then a man in the back stood up slowly. "I sold my cabin last year," he said, his voice shaking with rage. "She fined me $40,000 for architectural non-compliance on a deck my grandfather built in 1952. I couldn't afford to fight it. I sold to some company for half what it was worth. Now I know why." Another woman stood up. "She told me my mother's rose garden was a biohazard and threatened to have it destroyed by court order. We've lived here for 60 years. The testimonies kept coming, each one adding another layer to Margaret's systematic campaign of terror and theft. Margaret completely lost control at that point, her mask finally slipping. "Fine. Yes. I've been planning this since I heard Thomas was sick. That cabin is the crown jewel of this lake. It should belong to someone who appreciates it, not some 28-year-old girl who'll probably turn it into an Airbnb." Emma held up her phone triumphantly. "Did everyone hear that? She just admitted to planning this fraud for over a year." The room erupted like a volcano of suppressed rage. "She fined me $3,000 for having the wrong doormat," one man shouted. "My husband can't even fish anymore. She said it disturbs the fish's rights," a woman added. "I've been scared to plant flowers for 2 years," another voice called out. Margaret grabbed the microphone, her knuckles white. "You're all weak. Without me, this place would be chaos. I deserve that cabin. I've worked for it." But what exactly had Margaret been working on, and why did several homeowners suddenly look terrified when she mentioned having connections? Comment investigate if Emma should dig deeper, or fight if she should go straight to court. David Richardson arrived at the cabin the next morning, and I'd never been happier to see anyone in my life. He was a sharp 45-year-old former federal prosecutor who'd traded courtrooms for property law, and he had this way of looking at evidence that made you know he'd find every single skeleton in the closet. He surveyed the damage Margaret had caused, the overturned garbage still not fully cleaned up, the illegal sign blocking the path tire marks on Emma's lawn, where the HOA truck had deliberately driven through her garden. "Marcus told me this was bad. he said, adjusting his glasses and pulling out a tablet to photograph everything. "But this is harassment, fraud, and possible racketeering. Tell me everything, and I mean everything, even if it seems unimportant." Emma showed him every piece of evidence she'd collected, the violation notices with their impossible fines written in Margaret's distinctive handwriting, time-stamped photos of Margaret watching the cabin with binoculars, the recorded confession from the meeting, where Margaret admitted to planning this for over a year, and something interesting, strange offers to buy the cabin from Lakeside Properties LLC that had been arriving every few months for the past 2 years, always offering below market value. This company, David frowned, typing rapidly on his laptop while standing at Emma's kitchen counter. "Lakeside Properties LLC. Let me check something. Oh, this is very interesting. The CEO is Margaret Whitfield herself." Emma nearly dropped her coffee mug. "She owns a property company." David's fingers flew across the keyboard as he pulled up more records. "Created 2 years ago, right when your uncle got sick. The timing is not a coincidence. And look at this." He turned the screen toward us, showing a pattern that made my blood run cold. "She's been systematically trying to buy every lakefront cabin. She's made offers on all 5 waterfront properties. Yours is the only one that didn't sell." The pieces were starting to come together like a horrifying puzzle. "But why?" Emma asked. "What's so special about these 5 cabins?" David pulled up a map of the lake. If someone owned all 5, they'd control the entire eastern shoreline. That's incredibly valuable for development. David pulled up satellite images from the past 5 years, and what we saw made everything crystal clear. "Look at this," he said, zooming in on the shoreline. "See how these 5 cabins create a perfect crescent? If developed into a resort, this would be the premier lakefront destination in 3 states. We're talking about a $50 million project minimum." Emma stared at the screen in disbelief. "She's not just trying to steal my cabin. She wants to destroy everything my family built here." David nodded grimly. "And she's been systematically working toward it. Look at these property records. 2 cabins sold in the last 18 months, both after the owners were hit with massive HOA fines. The buyers' shell companies that trace back to, guess who?" The pattern was undeniable. Margaret had turned the HOA into a weapon of mass destruction, aimed at anyone who stood between her and her resort dreams. "But there's something else," David said, pulling up another document. "She made one crucial mistake. We drove down to the blocked path where Margaret had installed her illegal sign." David studied it carefully, then pulled out county maps on his tablet, cross-referencing with multiple databases. "Emma, this is huge. This path is an HOA property. It's not anyone's property. Look here. It's marked as a public easement, a designated lake access path that's been public since the 1880s. She can't block it." Emma stared at the documentation. "So she's lying." David's expression grew darker. "She's committing fraud, but there's more." He showed us another document that made everything click into place. "The HOA claims they have a 99-year lease on this path, signed by Margaret herself is both the HOA president and CEO of Lakeside Properties. She created a fake lease between her 2 roles." Emma's jaw dropped. "She made a fake lease with herself." David nodded grimly. "This is criminal conspiracy. She's using her HOA position to create false documents that benefit her company. That's federal crime territory." That afternoon brought another breakthrough when Dorothy knocked on Emma's door, looking around nervously like she was afraid Margaret might jump out of the bushes. "I can't stay quiet anymore," she whispered, clutching a folder to her chest. "You need to know something about Margaret." Emma let her in quickly, and David joined us in the living room. Dorothy's hands shook as she pulled out her phone. "I've lived here 15 years. Margaret, she doesn't live here." We all exchanged shocked looks. "What?" Emma gasped. Dorothy showed us dozens of photos with timestamps. "Every morning for 3 years, I walk my dog at 5 a.m. Margaret's car comes from the east, from Riverside. That's 15 miles away. She uses the old Johnson cabin. It's been empty for 5 years, as her address." The photos clearly showed Margaret's white Mercedes arriving from the wrong direction, day after day, year after year. David's eyes widened as the implications hit him. If she doesn't live in the HOA, she can't be president. Every vote, every fine, every decision she's made, all invalid. This is massive fraud. David dove deeper into the financial records that afternoon, and what he found was staggering. The HOA funds had been mysteriously decreasing year over year, with payments to Lakeside Properties for consulting that no one could explain. Margaret's salary had tripled in 3 years, going from $20,000 to $60,000 for what was supposed to be a volunteer position with a small stipend. Over $300,000 was missing from various accounts, hidden in a maze of fake invoices and phantom services. "She's not just trying to steal your cabin," David said, showing us spreadsheet after spreadsheet of damning evidence. "She's been stealing from everyone. This is a massive embezzlement scheme." But the biggest shock came when Emma found something in her uncle's old emails that connected all the dots. Emma had been going through Uncle Thomas's email archive when she found it, a forwarded message that made everything crystal clear. It was from someone named Patricia Miller to Margaret, with the subject line, "RE Lakefront Development," and dated 2 years ago. "Once you control all 5 cabins, the rezoning application will pass easily. A luxury resort on Clearwater Lake could net us millions. Start with the Harrison cabin. It has the best views and the largest shoreline. The old man won't last long, and his niece lives states away. It should be easy." Emma's face went pale. "She wants to tear down our cabins for a resort." David nodded grimly. "And she's been using her fake HOA position to force people out. She's created a reign of terror to steal property for development. Classic corruption, but on a scale that's genuinely impressive in its audacity." If Margaret didn't live in the HOA, how had she fooled everyone for 3 years? And who else was in on this massive fraud? Type "expose her" if you're ready for the big confrontation. Word travels fast in a small community, and Margaret must have sensed the walls closing in, because her behavior became increasingly erratic. That night, Emma's security cameras captured something that proved just how desperate Margaret had become. At midnight, the infrared footage showed Margaret creeping around the cabin like a burglar trying door handles and peering through windows. She was photographing everything, with her phone occasionally stopping to speak into it, like she was making some kind of video diary. The most chilling part was when she stood at Emma's bedroom window for a full 5 minutes, just staring, before finally retreating to her car. Emma didn't sleep at all after reviewing that footage, and honestly, neither did I when she sent it to me. This wasn't just HOA overreach anymore. This was stalking behavior that had us genuinely concerned for Emma's safety. The next morning brought Margaret's final ultimatum in the form of a certified letter that reeked of desperation and barely concealed threats. "Final notice. You have 24 hours to accept our generous offer of $150,000, half market value, or face immediate legal action. The HOA has connections in every court in this county. Judges, clerks, filing officers. We know them all. You will lose everything. Your uncle would be ashamed to see you destroying his legacy by refusing to work with the community. This is your last chance. Margaret Whitfield, President, Clearwater HOA." Emma called David immediately, reading the letter with a shaking voice. David actually laughed when he heard it. "Perfect. She just put her threats in writing. And about those connections I used to prosecute corrupt judges. Trust me, they're more scared of me than her. She just gave us evidence of attempted extortion and blackmail." That afternoon, Dorothy called with urgent news. "Emma dear, I just saw Margaret at the courthouse again. She was with Bradley, that clerk she's dating, and they were carrying boxes of files. I heard her say something about emergency documentation and preemptive filing. I think she's trying to file something against you before tomorrow's meeting." David immediately sprang into action, making calls to his contacts at the courthouse. Within an hour, he'd discovered Margaret's plan. She was attempting to file a fraudulent lien against Emma's property, claiming unpaid HOA debts. "She's desperate," David said. "This is actually good news. Desperate people make mistakes, and filing false liens is a federal crime. She's just added another charge to her rap sheet." Emma spent that day gathering her army of allies, and the response was overwhelming. 23 homeowners agreed to testify about Margaret's reign of terror, each with their own horror stories. The local news station expressed serious interest in the story. Fake HOA president terrorizes neighborhood was exactly the kind of investigation they loved. Even better, the sheriff's department confirmed they'd received multiple complaints about Margaret over the years, but could never prove anything because people were too scared to officially press charges. Dorothy brought over cookies and crucial intel that afternoon. "Margaret's been spotted at the courthouse a lot lately. She's dating a clerk there. That's how she's been filing all these false documents. His name is Bradley, and he's about as sharp as a bowling ball. She's got him wrapped around her finger." This explained how she'd managed to file so many official-looking documents without anyone questioning their validity. David prepared a presentation that would destroy Margaret completely. He had photos proving she didn't live in the HOA financial records showing the theft of over $300,000, the fake company documents for lakeside properties, the resort development plans that would destroy the entire neighborhood, and Margaret's written threats, including the one from that morning. "Tomorrow," he said with the confidence of someone who'd taken down bigger fish than Margaret, "we end this. She's given us everything we need to not just stop her, but to put her in federal prison." Emma looked out at the lake that evening, where her parents had gotten engaged 25 years ago, where she'd caught her first fish with Uncle Thomas, where every precious memory of her childhood lived in the gentle lapping of waves against the shore. "She picked the wrong family to mess with," Emma said quietly, and there was steel in her voice that reminded me why I was so proud of her. That night, Emma couldn't sleep again, but this time it wasn't from fear. She walked down to the dock, despite the no trespassing sign, remembering all those summers with Uncle Thomas, all those life lessons learned while fishing for bass and watching sunsets. The cabin wasn't just property. It was her heritage, her connection to everyone she'd loved and lost. Margaret was probably sleeping soundly in her real home in Riverside, confident in her connections, and convinced that a 28-year-old would crumble under pressure. She thought her pink suits and HOA title made her untouchable. She had no idea what was coming. The sunrise that morning was spectacular, painting the lake in shades of gold and rose, and Emma watched it with the calm of someone who knows they're on the right side of justice. Would Margaret show up to the meeting, or would she try one last desperate move? Comment, "It's time," if you're ready for the showdown. The community center had never been so packed in its entire existence. 73 homeowners crammed into a space meant for 50, with people standing along the walls and crowding in the doorway. 3 local reporters Emma had invited set up cameras in the back, their presence making several HOA board members shift nervously in their seats. Even Officer Rodriguez showed up off-duty, telling Emma he wanted to keep the peace. But I could see in his eyes he was there to watch Margaret finally get what she deserved. The tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife as everyone waited for the main event. Margaret strutted in at exactly 7 p.m. wearing her brightest pink suit yet, hot pink this time, with matching shoes that clicked authoritatively on the linoleum floor. She was flanked by her nephew Kyle, whom she introduced as her legal counsel, but who looked about as comfortable as a long-tailed cat in a room full of rocking chairs. The moment Margaret saw the packed room and the cameras, she froze in the doorway. "What is this?" she demanded, her voice already losing some of its usual authority. David stood up smoothly, connecting his laptop to the projector with practiced ease. "A special meeting to discuss your leadership, Mrs. Whitfield." Kyle squeaked out an objection that sounded more like a question. "This isn't on the agenda." Dorothy rose from her seat with surprising grace for her age. "Actually, I called this meeting. As the longest-standing resident, I have that right. Page 47 of the bylaws, which I'm sure Margaret knows by heart, since she's quoted them at us so many times." Several people chuckled, and Margaret's face began its familiar journey from pink to purple. David clicked to his first slide, and the words appeared in massive letters, "Margaret Whitfield, the truth." The room fell silent as everyone leaned forward, sensing that something monumental was about to happen. Margaret tried to regain control. "This is highly irregular. You can't just..." But David was already moving to the next slide. Question, where does our HOA president live? The next slides came in rapid succession, each one a nail in Margaret's coffin. Photos of Margaret arriving from Riverside every morning at 5:30 a.m., taken over weeks and months. The empty Johnson cabin at 12 Lakeview Drive, broken windows, visible lawn overgrown with weeds. County records show no Margaret Whitfield at 12 Lakeview Drive. In fact, no one had lived there for 5 years. The gasps from the audience grew louder with each revelation. "That's photoshopped!" Margaret shrieked, but her voice cracked betrayingly. David calmly clicked to the next slide, video footage from 3 different doorbell cameras, showing her daily commute all time-stamped and authenticated. Then came the killing blow. If she doesn't live here, she can't be president. The implications hit everyone at once. Every fine, every rule, every decision, all invalid. The room erupted in chaos as people realized what this meant. 3 years of fines, 3 years of fear, 3 years of illegal leadership. David raised his hand for silence and continued his devastating presentation. "Where did your HOA fees go?" The financial slides were even more damaging. Bank records showed transfer after transfer to Lakeside Properties, each one signed by Margaret on both sides as HOA president paying her own company. $300,000 had vanished into this scheme over 3 years. "She stole from us," someone shouted from the back. Margaret tried to defend herself. "I invested it for the community's future," but David was ready with the next slides. The resort development plans showing all 5 cabins demolished, replaced with a massive commercial development. "She planned to force you all out," David explained, showing emails between Margaret and her co-conspirators discussing how to systematically pressure homeowners into selling. The crowd's anger was palpable now, 3 years of suppressed rage finally finding an outlet. Then David played the audio from the previous meeting, Margaret's own voice filling the room through the speakers. "I've been planning this since I heard Thomas was sick. I deserve that cabin." The video Emma had recorded of Margaret sneaking around her property at night played next to the infrared footage, making Margaret look like the predator she was. "Still think I'm lying?" David asked the stunned audience. The floodgates opened as victim after victim stood to share their stories. "She fined me $5,000 for wrong-colored roses. Roses," an elderly man shouted. "I had to give away my dog because she said his bark violated noise ordinances at 2 p.m. on a Tuesday," a woman cried. "She threatened to foreclose on my home over a mailbox that was half an inch too tall." Dorothy delivered the final testimony. "She's terrorized us for 3 years, pretending to live here, pretending to care about standards, all while planning to destroy our homes for profit." Margaret completely lost control at that point, her carefully constructed facade crumbling like a house of cards in a hurricane. "You're all idiots," she exploded, spittle flying from her mouth. "This neighborhood was nothing before me. I brought order. I brought standards. These cabins are wasted on people like you. I was going to make something special, something profitable, something that mattered." She pointed at Emma with a shaking finger. "Especially you, some millennial who thinks she deserves a prime lakefront property just because her uncle left it to her. Thomas was a fool not to sell to me. I offered him good money." Emma stood up calm and collected. "And that's why you tried to steal it, because he said no." Margaret spun around wildly, addressing the room. "You should be thanking me. Property values would have tripled with my resort." Someone shouted back, "We don't want a resort, we want our homes." The vote was called by Dorothy, her voice strong and clear. "Motion to remove Margaret Whitfield as HOA president for fraud, theft, and violating our bylaws by not being a resident." The second came from at least a dozen voices simultaneously. "All in favor?" Dorothy asked. 73 hands shot up in unison, including Kyle's, before Margaret slapped them down. "You can't do this!" Margaret shrieked, mascara starting to run as tears of rage filled her eyes. "I have connections. I know judges. I'll sue every one of you. I'll take your home. Officer Rodriguez stepped forward. "Ma'am, making terroristic threats is a crime. So is fraud, embezzlement, and falsifying legal documents." David added the final blow. "The FBI will be very interested in your fake address scheme. Using a false address for official positions, that's federal mail fraud." Margaret's pink facade finally cracked completely. Her perfect hair was disheveled, her makeup running her pink suit wrinkled as she clutched the podium. I'll, she stammered, looking around desperately for any support and finding none. "You'll leave," Emma said firmly, standing tall, "and never bother any of us again." But would Margaret accept defeat, or did she have one last card to play, type justice, if you felt that satisfaction? What would you have said to Margaret 2 months later? I sat in the federal courthouse watching Margaret's complete transformation from HOA tyrant to defeated defendant. Gone was the power pink suit, replaced by a gray outfit that matched her newly visible roots, where the blonde dye had grown out. Her face looked 10 years older, without the armor of perfect makeup, and her hands trembled as she sat at the defendant's table. The courtroom was packed with her victims, all dressed in their Sunday best, ready to see justice served. The federal prosecutor, a no-nonsense woman named Jennifer Martinez, had built an airtight case that even Margaret's high-priced lawyer couldn't dent. The charges were serious enough to make anyone sweat federal mail fraud for using a fake address embezzlement of over $300,000, conspiracy to commit real estate fraud, and 47 separate counts of harassment and extortion. Each charge carried significant prison time, and the evidence was overwhelming. The prosecution's case unfolded like a masterclass in legal destruction. Jennifer Martinez laid out the evidence methodically, each piece building on the last, until the wall of guilt was insurmountable. 3 years of fake residency were proven through surveillance footage and witness testimony. Bank records show systematic theft labeled as consulting fees and improvement projects that never existed. The conspiracy with Lakeside Properties to force out homeowners and build a resort complete with emails, plans, and contracts. And of course, the 47 homeowners who had been terrorized each violation notice a count of extortion. The defendant didn't just break the law, Martinez stated in her closing argument. She weaponized an entire community organization designed to help neighbors live in harmony. She turned it into a criminal enterprise for personal gain, showing a callous disregard for the families she was supposed to serve. The witness testimony was devastating in its consistency and emotion. Emma took the stand first, speaking clearly and calmly about the morning Margaret called the police to remove her from her own home. She knew I was the legal owner. She had researched my uncle's property extensively, but she tried to use law enforcement as a weapon to steal my family's legacy. Emma's testimony was powerful, but it was Dorothy who really captured the courtroom's attention. "I'm 82 years old," she said, gripping the witness stand. "I've lived through wars, recessions, and personal tragedies, but nothing made me as afraid in my own home as Margaret Whitfield. I was scared to plant flowers in my own garden. I was afraid to have my grandchildren visit because they might laugh too loudly and get us fined. No one should have that kind of power over their neighbors." 27 victims told their stories throughout the trial, each one adding another brick to the wall surrounding Margaret. Margaret's defense crumbled faster than a cookie in milk. Her lawyer tried to paint her as an overzealous community volunteer. My client was simply passionate about maintaining standards and property values. And the judge, a stern man named Harold Washington, who'd seen every excuse in the book, cut him off. "Counselor, community standards don't include stealing $300,000 and filing false police reports. And they certainly don't include using a fake address to obtain a position of authority." When Margaret herself took the stand, she sealed her own fate with her arrogance. Instead of showing remorse, she doubled down. "These people don't understand vision. I was trying to improve property values. They should be thanking me," the prosecutor pounced. "By stealing their homes?" Margaret's response shocked even her own lawyer. "By making hard choices they were too weak to make. That neighborhood was full of outdated cabins and elderly people who couldn't maintain them properly. I was going to create something beautiful." The judge's verdict was delivered with a scathing condemnation that I'll never forget. "Ms. Whitfield, in my 30 years on the bench, I've rarely seen such a calculated abuse of power. You corrupted a community organization designed to help neighbors work together. You terrorized families, stole their money, and attempted to steal their homes. Most disturbing of all, you show no remorse, only arrogance and entitlement. The sentence was everything we'd hoped for: 5 years in federal prison, $500,000 in restitution to be paid to victims, a lifetime ban from serving on any HOA or community board, and 1,000 hours of community service upon release, focused on housing advocacy." Margaret collapsed in her chair, sobbing for the first time. "But I made that neighborhood beautiful. I gave it standards. I gave it rules." The judge's response was ice cold. "No, Ms. Whitfield, you made it fearful. You gave it tyranny. Take her away." Outside the courthouse, the media surrounded Emma as she gave a brief statement. "Justice was served today. Our community can heal now. We can go back to being neighbors who help each other instead of fear each other." A reporter asked if she planned to sue for additional damages, but Emma showed the grace that made me so proud. "No, I just want peace. I want to wake up in my cabin, make coffee, and watch the sunrise over the lake without worrying about fake violations. I want to plant whatever flowers I want." The crowd laughed, and even Rodriguez, there in full uniform to see the conclusion, cracked a smile. As we walked away from the courthouse, Emma linked her arm through mine. "Uncle Marcus, we did it. We actually did it." I squeezed her arm. "No, sweetheart, you did it. You stood up to a bully and won. But you'd think this would be the end of Margaret Whitfield's story, wouldn't you?" Drop a karma in the comments. If you believe what goes around comes around, 6 months after the trial, cabin number 5 had never looked more beautiful in its entire existence. Emma had embraced her freedom with enthusiasm, painting it a cheerful turquoise that would have given Margaret an aneurysm, planting a garden full of vegetables instead of HOA-approved flowers, building a new deck perfect for sunset watching, and installing a small library box labeled, "Take a book, leave a book, ignore HOA rules." The new HOA, led by Dorothy as interim president, operated on simple principles that she'd written on an index card. Help don't hurt, serve don't surveil, be neighbors, not police. The transformation in the community was remarkable. People were actually smiling at each other again. Children played freely without parents worrying about noise violations, and the sound of laughter returned to the lakeside. It was like watching a neighborhood come back to life after a long, dark winter. The community barbecue Emma hosted on the newly liberated lake path was the event of the summer. I manned the grill while Dorothy brought her famous potato salad that she'd been too scared to make for potlucks during Margaret's reign because it contained non-regulation ingredients, like bacon. You know, I said flipping burgers and watching the crowd of happy neighbors. Thomas would be so proud. You didn't just save the cabin, you saved the whole neighborhood. Officer Rodriguez, who would become a regular at community events and even helped build Emma's new deck, raised his beer in a toast to Emma, who proved that truth beats lies even when lies wear pink suits. Everyone laughed and raised their drinks, the sunset painting the lake in shades of gold and crimson. It was one of those perfect moments where everything felt right with the world. Emma had also started a newsletter for the neighborhood, Lake Life Post, featuring resident spotlights, fishing reports, and notably a section called Know Your Rights that explained HOA laws in plain English. The first issue's headline, "You can paint your door any color you want." It became an instant hit with people framing copies as a symbol of their newfound freedom. Dorothy contributed a recipe column called Non-Regulation Cooking, starting with her bacon potato salad recipe that Margaret had once tried to ban. The community garden that Margaret had outlawed was replanted with a vengeance. Tomatoes, corn, and even some definitely non-approved cannabis plants that someone cheekily labeled heritage herbs. That's when Emma's phone rang showing an unknown Florida number. She almost didn't answer, but something made her pick up. "Emma, this is Kyle, Margaret's nephew. I thought you should know. She's done it again." Emma put the phone on speaker so I could hear. "What do you mean?" Kyle's voice was a mixture of embarrassment and disbelief. "She got out on early release. Good behavior if you can believe it. Moved to Florida. Started using her middle name, Diane. Just got arrested yesterday for, well, you're not going to believe this." He sent over a news article that had us all gathering around Emma's phone to read, and what we saw was so perfectly karmic that Dorothy actually applauded. The headline read, "Florida woman arrested for HOA fraud scheme," and the article was pure gold. Orlando, Margaret Diane Whitfield, age 66, was arrested yesterday for impersonating an HOA president at Sunshine Estates. Residents say she collected over $50,000 in fake fees before anyone realized their community didn't actually have an HOA. She showed up with official-looking documents and started fining people for everything, said resident Jim Torres. Palm trees too tall, cars too shiny. She even fined someone for having too many flamingos. This is Florida. Flamingos are practically required. When arrested, Whitfield was reportedly trying to measure someone's grass with a ruler while screaming about standards. She now faces multiple federal charges, as this violates her previous conviction. If convicted, she faces up to 20 years in prison. The article included a photo of Margaret being led away in handcuffs, still wearing a pink suit, still with that helmet hair, looking indignant, even in defeat. Emma couldn't help but laugh, and soon we were all laughing, until our sides hurt. She shared the article in the neighborhood group chat, and within minutes it had 50 laughing emojis and comments like, "She never learns," and "Pink suits in Florida, that's the real crime." Dorothy summed it up perfectly while wiping tears of laughter from her eyes. Some people learn from their mistakes, others move to Florida and repeat them with flamingos. As the sun set over Lake Clearwater and the party continued around us, I raised my beer for one last toast of the evening. Friends, let this be a lesson to everyone here and anyone listening to this story. Emma here got a call from a crazy HOA president claiming she was trespassing in her own home. That president is now in federal prison twice. Emma's cabin is worth more than ever. Our community is free and happy, and Margaret, well, she's learning that orange jumpsuits don't come in pink. I looked around at the scene, neighbors chatting happily, kids playing on the beach, dogs running free without fear of non-regulation barking, and Emma standing on her dock with a peaceful smile, finally able to enjoy what was rightfully hers. The moral of this story, never try to steal someone's home, especially when they have the deed, the determination and the willingness to fight back. But, most importantly, if someone calls the cops claiming you're trespassing in your own home. Start recording, because that's not just wrong. That's a federal crime wrapped in a pink suit, and karma always finds the right address, even if you lie about yours. Emma stood on her dock one last time as the party wound down, watching the moonlight dance on the water. A new neighbor approached hesitantly. "Hi, I just moved into the old Johnson cabin. Someone said you're the person to ask about the lake path. Do I need HOA permission to use it?" Emma smiled warmly. "The path is free for everyone. No permission needed. Welcome to the neighborhood." "Just one thing. You're not into pink suits, are you?" They both laughed as another chapter began at Lake Clearwater, one built on trust, community, and the hard-won freedom to plant whatever flowers you damn well please. The end. If you made it this far, you're a legend. Comment where you're watching from and tell me, what would you plant in your non-regulation garden? And don't forget to subscribe for more stories of Karens getting exactly what they deserve.
This has been BD Stories, where reality is stranger, prettier, and way funnier than fiction. Subscribe now and hit that bell before things get even weirder.